Okay, this is Ron. I am back at you for the moment. I'm working on my 2003, my beloved 2003 F350 dually 6.0 diesel. It's a truck that my brother gave me, so it has a lot of sentimental value. But I don't pretend to know anything about these trucks. Actually, I know very little. I mean, I've done a lot of mechanic work in my day, but I'm no expert on these trucks. I certainly never knew anything about the VGT turbo and what it meant. I didn't even know what the VGT turbo was, that it had vanes inside and all that stuff. But anyway, long story short, I took this thing to a buddy and he scanned it for me. And the code, I've got two codes. One was a P132B and another was P006A, I believe. But anyway, one of the things he said was the map sensor could be stuck, clogged up in the fitting coming out of the intake manifold. The map sensor fitting, it's down inside, and then it feeds the vacuum hose to the map sensor. And the other thing was the turbo could be sticking. Well, I didn't know what he meant by the turbo sticking. That didn't make any sense to me, but it's my truck. It's got to be fixed. So I went ahead and pulled the turbo. Thought that I would replace the turbo. And while I had it off, I said, well, let me just go ahead and take it apart. And one thing I noticed, it is a rebuilt turbo. It's got a rebuilt sticker on it. So I said, okay. I mean, that's good because this truck has like 358,000 miles on it, I believe. But the motor was replaced almost 150,000 miles ago. So I know this turbo was not the original. Otherwise, I would have replaced it without thinking. But I pulled it apart. And when I did, I noticed a few things. Number one, that this unison ring right here was frozen to this flange right here when I separated these two units. Now this unison ring, of course, it's got to rotate. It will open and close these vanes, but it was frozen on this shoulder right here. It was frozen solid on that shoulder. And you can see that the unison ring, it's got to go on. It's got to be lined up over that actuator for the VGT. But anyway, you can see I've got plenty of movement. I mean, it rattles a little bit and it rotates easily. So before, when I took this off, this ring was frozen solid on this flange. So the first thing I did was, after prying it off, I took a small chisel, sharp chisel, and just lightly went around and busted the rust off. And the rust would just, fly off in little chips. It was just flaking off. And then I went around it with a file to knock off any high spots. I went around the flange with a file and then sanded it. So that pretty much cleaned the rust off the flange. So then I went and cleaned the rest of this stuff. And after pulling these little vanes out, I took a little die grinder with a sander and I sanded what I could. And then I even took a conditioning disc and I cut it down with a pair of scissors. So it was maybe 1 inch in diameter. And I went around and cleaned up everything really well. Then I cleaned up all the other surfaces that were crusty. So, and then it started looking pretty good. I'm like, hey, you know what? I might have something here because the turbo doesn't have any end play here. And it feels really nice and smooth. And I know it's been replaced before. So I said, why am I going to spend over $1,000 to replace this whole unit when I see what the problem is? So I cleaned everything up, and as you can see, you're probably wondering, why the heck is it orange? Well, that's high heat header paint, 1200 to 2000 degree paint. And the problem with this truck is it wasn't worn out. Some of these rings, from what I've seen and went online and looked, some of these unison rings, this hole is actually worn almost over into these slots. I mean, you can see a lot of slop where the actuator would come in contact with that, but this one looks pretty good. I mean, that slot looks very, very good, which tells me that this, that's one thing that tells me that this turbo is not worn out. And, you know, the in play and the feel of it, and, you know, lack of oil coming out of it, and so forth. But this truck actually sat more than it ran. So, you know, I was getting moisture up in here and had a rust issue. So I decided after cleaning it, I would go ahead and paint it with high heat paint. And I know that's probably nobody else does that from what I've seen. I went online and looked, but it makes more sense to me than slapping a bunch of anti-seize or never seize, you know, in these veins. Because to me, that anti-seize, I mean, I don't even use anti-seize on lug nuts like a lot of people do, because I find that it gets hard. You know, white lube on lug nuts is a lot better than anti-seize. I don't use anti-seize on anything that has to really move. If I'm going to put a bolt in or a stud in or something that I want to get out later, and only in high heat applications, then I'll use, you know, anti-seize. But for something like this, I don't think it's going to work well once it gets hot a few times and starts to harden up, and, you know, it's going to cause the veins to stick. Anyway, that's my opinion. I think I'm much better off with high heat paint. It makes more sense to me. But I didn't use so much so that the unison ring wouldn't rotate on the shoulder. So that's very important. We got to make sure everything still moves freely. But if it's coated and everything moves freely, then I don't see where we've hurt anything. So I'm waiting on a few parts from the Ford dealer tomorrow, and then I can go ahead and put this thing together. But I'm confident that's going to cure my problem with the truck, because that ring was froze. And I took out the piston here, and, you know, just made sure everything looked good and cleaned it up. But I found that this has to be timed correctly when you put it back together, and it can be out of time if you can put it together out of time. So I know that when I rotate this almost all the way to this farthest position to the right, that this piston is just about at the end of its stroke. And actually, when I put the cap on, that piston would hit the cap before it jumped the tooth and got out of time again. So it'll go just about all the way to the end. So, but let's see, that's all I can think of. I'll put it back together. I'm putting new O-rings on everything, new O-rings on the drain tube, and I'm thinking I should be good to go. One thing I am going to do, just personal preference, I'm replacing this feed line, because, you know, 19 years old on this feed line with this rubber hose inside. I'm just thinking, if that thing just happened to start leaking and spraying hot oil on that turbo, I don't know what would happen. I just don't like the idea of that. So I'm replacing this line before I put the turbo back in. So, like I say, I don't know anything about these things. It's just, you know, a lot of times it's just common, as a mechanic, common sense, and this is the way I'm doing it. Okay, I hope it helps.